abuses. That brings me to Mr. Kennedy. A recent analysis showed that Mr. Kennedy has made 114 separate appearances in just the last 4 years where he has espoused anti-vaccine views or spread information about the efficacy of vaccines, misinformation specifically. In 36 of those instances, Mr. Kennedy directly linked vaccines to autism. Last week, Mr. Kennedy was given ample authority on a bipartisan basis to recant his decades-long career peddling anti-vaccine conspiracies. Instead, he spent his time with us dodging and weaving and gave no indication that if confirmed as HHS Secretary, he would stand by the long-settled science surrounding routine vaccinations. Just take the Samoa measles outbreak as an example. Mr. Kennedy told me, and I quote, "We don't know what was killing them," speaking about the 83 measles deaths during an outbreak of the disease in 2019. Just yesterday, colleagues, the Director General of Health from Samoa called this claim a total fabrication. Peddling these conspiracy theories as the nation's chief health officer is going to be deadly for kids across the country. On abortion, Mr. Kennedy's answers once again raised still more questions. He refused to tell us whether he would blindly follow a directive from Donald Trump to break the law and end access to mifepristone. And he seemed to have no understanding of his role in enforcing existing federal laws that guarantee women the right to life-saving abortion care. Mr. Kennedy also failed on several occasions to show a basic understanding of the Medicare and Medicaid programs he would be tasked with overseeing. Colleagues, that alone should be disqualifying. Mr. Kennedy has given us no reason to believe he'll be anything other than a rubber stamp for plans to gut Medicaid and rip health care away from the American people, and be a yes man if ordered by Musk or Trump to take an illegal action. I close with this, colleagues. Today we're going to make a judgment about the future of science in this country. We're going to make decisions that are going to impact the health and well-being of Americans for years to come. I agree, and I say this to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, that the healthcare status quo needs substantial changes so we get better, more affordable care to patients. And that leaves, given my statement, the question in front of us now that's pretty simple. Do senators want their legacy to include disregarding basic health science and instead elevate conspiracy theorists? Making Robert Kennedy Secretary of Health and Human Services, in my view, colleagues, would be a grave threat to the health of the American people. And I urge my colleagues this morning to vote no.
So Senator Wyden, we have all of our members here. Senator Wyden and I have agreed that we will have 2 or 3 on each side who wanted to make statements do so before the vote. So please, everyone, hold with us while we have those statements made, and then we will proceed to the vote. I know we've got a lot of folks here pushing on some. Do you want to vote now?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, I've got several colleagues who were under the impression after we talked that we would have 2 or 3, and I'm happy for both sides to make brief remarks, and I'd still like to stay with that.
I did make that commitment, and so I could say to my colleagues on my side, I would appreciate it if you would hold your remarks until after the vote. We will let a couple on your side have their remarks, and then we will proceed to the vote.
Great, thank you.
And who would be next?
Senator Cantwell.
Senator Cantwell.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I didn't, when you said 2 or 3 people, I didn't know who you had in mind, but being next in seniority, I appreciate the opportunity. Today is very concerning to me because of the future of what I think our nation faces. When I think of this issue, I think of my Pacific Northwest leadership, how Paul Allen, on his own, invested $100 million to fight Ebola. I think of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, not just trying to eradicate polio and work on these issues, but to think of a regime that helps not just our nation's health.
A pretty good merge
but
there
global
at the
health. So with the UW, University of Washington, the
pothole
Cancer
filling crew
Research Center,
constructions.
all of these entities are a collaboration of saying we have to go faster in solving these threats to our nation as it relates to health. Now, we can have a big discussion, which I think you guys all want to have a big discussion about whether and when what happened in the Wuhan province. But I can tell you, we were the first city. We had the first patient. We had the first people who died in nursing homes. We had an emergency room at a hospital who basically was just begging for any equipment we could get them. The whole community stood up and moved as fast as we possibly could and broke down barriers to save lives. And that is what we have to continue to do on innovation. We cannot let another country get ahead of us on some sort of warfare issue and not have a response when it comes to a vaccine. So the most challenging, I wanted to vote for Mr. Kennedy in the context of my family's history. My dad stood behind his father the night his father gave the famous speech. I told him in my office, in my family, the Kennedys stood up. But when he answered Senator Cassidy's question, and he couldn't even give him the answer that, yes, the data is there to support vaccines today. I don't need any more data. All of a sudden, I saw this world that we got affected by in Seattle not being stood up for. I need someone at HHS who is going to say we're going to be a leader in medical technology, science, vaccines. We are going to fight foreign powers. We are going to be there to provide global health. And I don't want a recalcitrant. I need a leader, and that is why I'm voting no.
Thank you. Senator Wyden and I have agreed that Senator Warnock will now speak. Following Senator Warnock, we will proceed to the vote, and then anyone else who wants to make remarks will be allowed to make remarks. Senator Warnock.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. At a rally a few months ago, Donald Trump said that he was going to allow Mr. Robert Kennedy to, quote, go wild on health. Go wild. Of all the things that I can think of that I'd like to see a Secretary of Health and Human Services do, go wild is not on the list. Mr. Robert Kennedy is manifestly unqualified for the job he seeks. And in both my live and written questions for the record, he failed to commit to protecting access to affordable health care, failed to commit to protecting the people who are protecting us. The problem that the CDC has is that every day these noble civil servants and workers protect us from dangers that we don't see. And often you don't get credit for protecting people from things that they don't see. I simply do not trust him to oversee the CDC. He's unqualified, and I dare say everybody here knows it.
Yep.
We need a serious person at the helm of the HHS, an agency responsible for about half of the health of about half of all Americans. Mr. Kennedy appears more obsessed in chasing conspiracy theories than chasing solutions to lower healthcare costs for working families in Georgia and to make sure that we are protected. The last thing we need is a dilettante. healthcare costs for Georgians, who's going to undermine basic science in public health, who puts his own interests above the health and the well-being of others, for the health and well-being of all of our families, the people who count on us to think about them in these rooms of power. I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle
Now have not only a quorum, but all members of the committee are present. I move that the committee favorably report the nomination of the Honorable Robert F. Kennedy Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. Is there a second? Second. There is a second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grassley. Aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Scott. Aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Langford. Aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Wyden.
No.
Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Cantwell.
No.
Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Warnock.
No.
Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Chairman. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Chairman, the final tally is 14 ayes, 13 nays.
The vote was, would the clerk please restate the vote?
Mr. Chairman, the final tally was 14 ayes, 13 nays.
The vote was 14-13. The nomination is reported favorably. We will now turn to other senators who would like to make a statement. Since I asked my Republican colleagues to hold off at the outset, I'll go to the Republican side next. First, Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I voted aye today, and I want to just briefly explain why. I believe in my 65 years.
Okay, you just watched 14 ayes, 13 noes, party line vote there to advance Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination to be the next Secretary of the Health and Human Services Department there in the government to the full Senate now. That's where the next step will be. I want to join Ryan Nobles again, who's there on Capitol Hill, as well as Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, and Dr. Vin Gupta, an NBC News medical contributor. So Cassidy was the one we were watching closely here. Ryan seemed uncertain how he would vote. He voted yes. Do we have any background on his thinking?
Yeah, so right before the committee vote, he tweeted out a statement on the X platform where he said that he had, quote, a very intense conversation with Bobby and the White House over the weekend. And even this morning, he said, I want to thank VP JD, that's JD Vance, specifically for his honest counsel with the serious commitments I've received from the administration and the opportunity to make progress on the issues we agree on, like healthy foods and a pro-American agenda. I will vote yes. And that right there sealed the fate of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He makes it out of the committee by a very tight margin, 14-13, completely along party lines.
Ryan, just a moment.
Now,
we're hearing.
Yep.
We're seeing Cassidy speaking. Okay, a little confusion there. He just said he's going to speak on the floor in the next hour or so. Apologies for the interruption. Ryan, please continue.
No worries. And so, Anna, for all intents and purposes, this means that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will be the next Health and Human Services Secretary. He will still need a full vote on the floor of the House of Representatives, on the full floor of the Senate. And there is the possibility that there could be 4 Republican senators who are still not favorable of his nomination, but that seems very unlikely. You could see perhaps Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, who's been very vocal about his concerns about Kennedy's stance on vaccines, particularly the polio vaccine, McConnell being a polio survivor himself, voting no. But the fact that Cassidy was a yes vote, and not only a yes vote, but kind of an affirmative yes vote, where he said he feels comfortable and that his concerns were quelled by these conversations with the White House and the Vice President and Kennedy himself, it seems very unlikely that the nomination will be tripped up at any point. And once again, Anna, this is an example of the White House and the Trump administration, the president himself, asserting his will, his political will, over his Republican colleagues in Congress. He has made it very clear since winning re-election to a second term that he wanted the cabinet picks that he picked in those positions, and that he did not want any opposition from the Senate, particularly because the Republicans control the Senate. And so this is the manifestation of that. There is a very much an unwillingness by Republicans in the Senate right now to stand up to Trump in any sort of meaningful way. The confirmation process being the most obvious example of that, but we're also seeing it play out in the budget process, in these moves that Trump has made with the purging of officials at the FBI, the wide breadth that he's given Elon Musk to go in and try and find places to cut in the federal government and gain access to these government systems. We're just not seeing any pushback from Republicans in the Senate, and that's how that played out today in this committee vote, Anna.
And Bill Cassidy saying he's going to speak on the Senate floor at 11:45 this morning. So in a little over an hour, we'll of course be watching for those comments. I was reminded that Cassidy, during his Q&A with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at the hearing just last week, he came out and said, quote, "If you come out unequivocally and say vaccines are safe, it does not cause autism, that would have an incredible impact." And just this morning, Dr. Gupta, we're seeing President Trump sending out misleading information about autism as he's trying to boost RFK Jr. and his nomination. Can you just address some of the misinformation that is out there, and also give us your reaction to what we all witnessed in real time, the advancement of the nomination to the full Senate?
Yeah, you bet, Anna. First of all, I think all of our lives have gotten harder in healthcare, and this is going to be a challenging 4 years navigating this. We're going to be having these conversations often. And so let's begin with your prompt on autism. Let's be really clear here for everybody out there. Vaccines do not cause autism. That's critical to state in unequivocal terms. They do not cause autism. Here's the reason why we're seeing more diagnosis. Because that's what the president was saying earlier today. One, we're diagnosing it more. There's more awareness on it, which is a good thing. There's better medical care. There's better screening tools. So that's number one. There's greater just an ability to get care and to get diagnosed. Very good thing. But yes, we have more cases since, say, 1970. The other big thing that the president and others are leaving out is, frankly, the biggest risk factor are environmental, their genetic, their maternal age and paternal age. And we know, Anna, since 1970, the average age of first birth for women was 21. Now it's 27. For men, they've gotten older at first paternal age. Also, air quality. The irony here is that as we roll back environmental protections, we're talking about autism. Turns out air quality is actually a big risk factor, poor air quality, for the development of autism. So the reality here is in the next 4 years, we're going to have to talk about facts. There are reasons why we're seeing an increased incidence of autism. They have nothing to do with vaccines.
And Peter Baker, RFK Jr. is just one that we're watching today. There's Tulsi Gabbard a little bit later, and seeing how this all went down with RFK Jr. What are your expectations?